The saloon doors creaked open that night, and for a moment, the music, the laughter, and the clinking of glasses froze midair. A native girl stepped inside, her steps quiet, her eyes steady, carrying a silence that felt heavier than any gun hanging on a cowboy's belt. In a place where whiskey flowed louder than truth and prejudice was sharper than any knife, her presence was a storm waiting to break. Men who had spent their lives gambling, fighting, and boasting found themselves staring at her, unsure if they should mock her, fear her, or simply bow to the gravity she carried. She said nothing, yet the silence seemed to bend around her. Dust clung to her moccasins, and the dim lamplight flickered across her face, revealing no trace of hesitation. The West was cruel to outsiders, crueler still to women who dared to cross invisible lines. And yet here she was, standing in the very heart of a place that had never welcomed her kind. Every eye fixed on her, not because of her fragility, but because of the quiet fire in her presence, something that whispered she had come with purpose. At the bar, the bartender froze, his hand hovering over glass. Men muttered, shifting in their seats, unsure of what to do. Some smirked, expecting her to falter. Others leaned forward, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The saloon, usually alive with the chaos of cards, whiskey, and laughter, had become a theater of silence, waiting for her first move. But she did not seek the bar, nor the stage, nor the men who measured worth by noise. Instead, she walked to the center of the room, every step echoing like the strike of a drum. Her silence was no weakness, it was defiance. It was the kind of silence that exposed the truth of those around her, stripping their bravado down to fear. And for the first time, the town that prided itself on control realized it had none. By midnight, the saloon was no longer the same. Men who had ruled with fists and guns found themselves unsteady, shaken by a presence that had not lifted a weapon, had not spoken a word. The girl had entered in silence, but the echo of that silence changed everything. That night, the West learned a lesson it rarely remembered. Sometimes the loudest voice comes not from those who shout, but from those who dare to walk into the fire without saying a single word. As the girl stood in the center of the saloon, the air thickened with unease. The pianist's hands hovered above the keys, frozen mid-song, as though even the piano feared breaking the silence she carried. Cowboys who had faced duels at dawn shifted nervously in their chairs, their hands inching toward pistols, not out of courage, but uncertainty. It was not what she did, but what she didn't do, that unsettled them most. She neither pleaded for attention nor shrank beneath their stares. She simply existed with a weight that demanded acknowledgement. The sheriff, seated in the corner, watched her with narrowed eyes. He had built his authority on fear, his badge shining as much from power as from intimidation. To him, the saloon was a kingdom where no one dared challenge his presence. Yet as he studied her, he felt something he hadn't in years: doubt. Her silence was not submission, it was judgment. And though she said nothing, the sheriff felt exposed, as if the years of corruption and cruelty that stained his hands were suddenly visible to all. A drunk rancher laughed loudly, breaking the tension with forced bravado. He stumbled toward her, mocking her presence, his words slurred and cruel. But before anyone could move, the girl turned her gaze upon him. Her eyes, dark and steady, froze him in place. The laughter died in his throat, replaced by a shiver that rippled through the room. He staggered back, as though pushed by an unseen force, and collapsed into his chair, silent. The saloon erupted in whispers, realizing she had not needed words to bring a man to his knees. The bartender, whose hands had trembled on the glass, finally set it down and cleared his throat. "What do you want, girl?" he asked, his voice low but carrying across the room. She did not answer, not yet. Instead, she stepped toward the bar, her moccasins brushing against the wooden floor. Each step deepened the silence, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Men who had never feared the crack of gunfire now felt their hearts pound in their chests at the sound of her quiet approach. When she reached the bar, she placed a single feather upon it. The gesture was simple, but in the Old West, symbols carried more power than bullets. The room felt utterly still, for no one understood its meaning, but everyone knew it meant something. And in that not knowing, the fear grew, weaving itself into the hearts of all who watched. The feather lay on the bar like a challenge, its softness cutting sharper than steel. Some recognized it as a token from her people, a mark often used in rituals of judgment or remembrance. To others, it was only a mystery, yet one that demanded respect. The bartender swallowed hard, afraid to touch it, as though the feather itself burned with unspoken truth. The sheriff rose slowly, his chair scraping across the floor. His boots echoed as he crossed the saloon, each step calculated, each gesture deliberate. He stopped only a few feet from her, his hand brushing the revolver at his side. "This is my town," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed unease. "You come in here uninvited, and you bring this." He gestured to the feather with a sneer, but his words fell flat. The room could sense that even he did not believe his own strength in this moment. The girl did not flinch. Her silence was not weakness, but a mirror, forcing him to see himself through the eyes of every man and woman present. And in that reflection, his power seemed smaller, thinner. The feather was no weapon, yet it stripped the sheriff of the control he had wielded for years. For the first time, his voice, once enough to silence a room, felt powerless against her quiet defiance. A gambler at the corner table muttered, "It's a warning." His words spread quickly, carried in hushed tones from mouth to mouth. The townsfolk began to murmur, their minds filling the silence with their own fears and suspicions. Was the feather a sign of revenge, a curse, or a promise that the injustices long hidden would soon come to light? No one knew, and that mystery held them tighter than any chain. The sheriff's jaw tightened, his pride refusing to bend. "If you've come here to threaten me," he said, louder now, trying to claim the room, "you'll find the West answers only to steel." Yet even as his hand hovered over his revolver, no one moved to support him. The people who once feared him now feared her silence more. And in that moment, the saloon, the sheriff's kingdom, was no longer his. The sheriff's hand hovered near his revolver, but the girl's silence weighed heavier than the steel at his side. She did not blink, did not shift, did not break the quiet that had swallowed the saloon whole. It was as if the entire town had gathered inside those four walls, waiting to see who would falter first. And then, something unexpected happened. The sheriff's fingers twitched, but instead of drawing his gun, he clenched them into a fist and let his hand fall. The whisper of surrender rippled through the crowd louder than a gunshot. The farmer who had been playing cards in the corner leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "Maybe it's time someone else held this town accountable." Heads turned sharply toward him, for he was no man of power, only a worker known for his quiet labor on the outskirts. Yet emboldened by the girl's presence, his words carried weight. Others, who had long endured the sheriff's cruelty, began to murmur in agreement. The balance of fear was shifting, not through violence, but through the courage of those who finally dared to speak. The sheriff's face darkened, his authority unraveling before his eyes. He barked at the townsfolk, demanding silence, but the sound of his voice no longer carried the same grip. Every time he shouted, the girl's quiet presence seemed to erase his power, leaving his words hollow. The people did not rise in open rebellion, but the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. His reign was breaking. At last, the girl reached for the feather on the bar and held it up for all to see. The lamplight caught it, making it glow against the smoke-filled air. Though she still said nothing, the meaning was clear enough. The feather was not a curse, nor a plea. It was a reminder that silence could reveal truth, that honor did not belong only to the loud or the powerful, and that one act of quiet defiance could ignite an entire town. When she lowered the feather, no one looked to the sheriff anymore. All eyes turned to her, and to one another, realizing they had been prisoners not of steel, but of fear. And in that realization, something unbreakable began to form. A unity stronger than the sheriff's badge, stronger than his gun, stronger even than his pride. The sheriff, desperate to reclaim control, slammed his hand on the bar. "Enough," he roared, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. But even as his words echoed through the saloon, they landed with the emptiness of a man no longer believed. The townsfolk who once cowered beneath his authority now met his gaze without flinching. It was not defiance in their eyes. It was freedom. His power had not been stripped by force. but by the quiet courage of one girl who refused to bow. The bartender, who had served under the sheriff's shadow for years, poured a glass of whiskey and set it in front of the girl. His hands no longer trembled. "For her," he said simply, his voice steady. A ripple of agreement passed through the room. Men who once feared the sheriff nodded in quiet solidarity. Women who had endured his arrogance held their children closer, their eyes bright with hope. The saloon, once his fortress, had become her stage. The girl lifted the glass, not to drink, but to raise it high. The gesture, silent yet undeniable, carried the weight of a toast. A toast to change, to courage, to a future where fear no longer ruled. The crowd responded with a murmur of approval, soft at first, then louder, until the saloon shook with the sound of voices united. For the first time, the sheriff was drowned out, not by guns, but by the people he had ruled with an iron hand. The sheriff's pride could not bear the sight. His hand shot to his revolver, the motion fast and desperate. But before he could draw, half a dozen hands moved. Farmers, gamblers, ranchers, even the quiet piano player. Guns did not rise to kill, only to warn, their barrels steady and cold. For the first time, the sheriff stood alone, his power gone, his voice silenced by the very people who once fed his authority. And the girl, still silent, stepped forward once more. She set the glass back on the bar, placed a feather atop it, and turned toward the doors. As she walked out into the night, the people followed her with their eyes, knowing they would never forget this moment. The saloon, and the town itself, was no longer the same. The sheriff had been unseated, not by bullets, but by silence, and by the courage it inspired. The next morning, the town awoke to a new rhythm. The saloon, once the sheriff's stronghold, had become the place where whispers of change began. Men gathered outside, not to gamble or drink, but to speak in hushed tones about what they had seen. Some called it madness, others called it prophecy. But none could deny that the native girl's silence had cracked something in their town, something that could not be mended with threats or guns. The sheriff tried to reassert control, parading his badge and boasting of law and order. Yet his words felt thinner than smoke, slipping through the cracks of a power that no longer held. Where once his commands were followed without question, now men exchanged glances instead of obedience. The fear that had ruled the town for years was no longer in his hands. It had shifted to the memory of a girl who needed no weapon to disarm him. The farmer who had spoken in the saloon found himself approached by neighbors he barely knew. They asked what he thought it meant, whether the girl's silence was a warning or a promise. He had no answers, but his voice carried further now, as though the girl's courage had opened a door for others to speak. He told them simply, "She showed us what we already knew but never dared to say. That fear dies when you stop feeding it." His words spread quickly, carried from porch to porch until they echoed like gospel. Women in town, long accustomed to lowering their eyes in silence, began to stand taller. Children played with new daring in their voices, unafraid of the sheriff's shadow. Even the old men, hardened by years of surviving under the weight of prejudice, admitted they had felt something that night, a shift in the very soul of the town. The saloon had always been a place of noise, yet its quietest night had spoken the loudest truth. The girl herself did not return. She had walked into the night without a word, and the prairie swallowed her footsteps. But her absence only deepened her presence. She had left behind not a threat, not a curse, but a silence so profound it echoed through every corner of the town. They had expected her to vanish like a shadow, yet she remained in every conversation, every heartbeat, every glance of doubt cast toward the sheriff. As days turned into weeks, the sheriff's grip weakened further. He barked his orders louder, tried to raise taxes, tried to remind the town who carried the law. But each act of force only revealed his desperation. The people no longer feared him. They pitied him. The authority he once wielded with his badge and his gun had been stripped bare by the memory of a girl who carried no weapon, no title, only silence. And silence, it seemed, was stronger than steel. The bartender, once a quiet accomplice to the sheriff's reign, became one of the first to break openly from his shadow. One evening, he declared that no drink would be served to the sheriff unless he paid with his own coin. The crowd gasped, waiting for violence. But none came. The sheriff sputtered, raged, then stormed out, his pride bleeding in the dust. That small act of defiance became a spark, and others followed. Farmers refused to pay his inflated fees. Mothers refused to bow their heads when he passed. The town itself was beginning to breathe again. The gambler who had named the feather a warning spoke of it often. He told anyone who would listen that the girl had not come to curse them, but to remind them. She held a mirror up to us, he said, and we saw what we had become. Now we must decide what we will be. His words, carried with the rhythm of cards shuffling and dice rolling, began to spread beyond the saloon, reaching neighboring towns. Stories grew, turning her into legend. Some said she was an angel of judgment, others that she was a spirit sent to break the sheriff's pride. But for those who had seen her, the truth was simpler and more powerful. She was a girl who dared to walk into fire without speaking a word, and in doing so, she taught an entire town that silence could reveal more than violence ever could. By the time autumn winds swept across the plains, the sheriff's reign was all but broken. He still wore the badge, still carried the gun, but they were empty symbols now. His power had been hollowed out, replaced by a memory no bullet could erase. The native girl had walked into their saloon in silence, and though she was gone, her presence remained. The town was no longer the same, and it would never be again. Winter came hard that year, coating the town in frost and silence. Yet the quiet that once belonged to fear now belonged to something else: resolve. The townsfolk gathered more often, not in the sheriff's office or under his commands, but in the saloon that had become the birthplace of their awakening. They spoke not of what the sheriff ordered, but of what they would allow. And every conversation circled back to the girl, as if her silence still sat among them, guiding their choices without a single word. The sheriff, cornered by the erosion of his power, grew reckless. He threatened, he shouted, he even drew his gun on men who refused to obey. But where once his violence commanded silence, now it ignited defiance. Farmers stood taller, gamblers stared back with steady eyes, and women whispered courage into their children's ears. The sheriff's every attempt to tighten his grip only loosened it further. The harder he fought, the clearer it became. The town was no longer his. One night, he stormed into the saloon, furious, determined to reclaim his throne. He slammed his badge onto the bar, declaring that anyone who stood against him stood against the law itself. But the bartender, the same man who once bowed to every command, calmly pushed the badge aside and poured a drink, not for the sheriff, but for the farmer sitting nearby. The room erupted in murmurs, and the sheriff's face turned pale. His power had not been stolen in a duel. It had been quietly handed to another. The farmer, startled by the gesture, shook his head, refusing to claim any mantle of leadership. But the people looked at him with eyes that carried something new: trust. Not because he sought it, but because he had never asked for it. They saw in him the same endurance, the same quiet strength they had once seen in the girl. And in their hearts, they knew that power no longer belonged to one man's gun. It belonged to their shared courage. That night, the sheriff left the saloon defeated, his boots dragging through the dust. He still wore his revolver, still carried his pride, but he no longer carried the town. The people had taken it back, and they had done so not with blood, but with silence. The same silence the girl had carried into the saloon months before. By spring, the story had spread far beyond town. Travelers carried it on their lips, and with each retelling, the girl became larger than life. Some said she was a spirit of the plains. Others swore she was the daughter of a fallen chief sent to deliver judgment. Whatever the truth, her legend grew with each mile, shaping her into a symbol that could not be forgotten. Wherever her story was told, it stirred something in the hearts of those who listened. Other towns, plagued by their own corrupt sheriffs and prideful men, began to whisper her name. They told of how she entered a saloon in silence and broke the chains of fear without firing a shot. They told of how a feather on a bar carried more power than the sheriff's badge. And they told of how a town that had once bent under tyranny now walked upright, free, forever changed. The farmer, who had never asked to be part of any legend, carried on with his work. He tilled his fields, tended his animals, and lived simply. Yet wherever he went, people looked to him differently. They saw not just a man of soil, but a man touched by something greater. He did not seek their admiration, but it followed him like a shadow. The quiet strength he had carried his whole life now became the foundation on which the town rebuilt itself. The sheriff, stripped of power, drifted further into obscurity. Some said he left the plains altogether, unable to endure the humiliation. Others swore they saw him wandering the desert, haunted by the silence that had unmade him. His name faded from memory, replaced by the story of the girl who had walked into his kingdom and dismantled it without a word. And so, the town lived on, not in the shadow of fear, but in the light of a story that would never die. The saloon remained the heart of it, not because of whiskey or games, but because of one night when a native girl entered in silence and proved that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it says nothing at all. Yet in that nothing, it speaks louder than everything. As the years rolled on, the town became a different place. Where once fear lingered in every corner, there was now a sense of pride rooted in the memory of that night. New generations grew up hearing the story of the native girl who walked into the saloon without a word and turned the town upside down. Children played in the streets, pretending to be her, standing tall in silence until others gave way. Her legend was not told as just a moment of defiance, but as the birth of a new way of living, where dignity outweighed intimidation, and courage came not from noise, but from truth. The townsfolk themselves carried her lesson forward. When disputes rose, they no longer turned to threats or guns. Instead, they remembered the stillness of her gaze, the feather on the bar, and the way silence had stripped the sheriff of his power. It became their compass, their unspoken law. And soon, neighboring towns began to look toward them as an example, wondering how a single night had planted such unshakable change. The farmer, once ordinary and invisible, became a quiet leader among his people. He never sought titles, never raised himself above others, yet men and women alike came to him for advice. They saw in him the same humility that had given strength to the girl, and they trusted him because he had never demanded their trust. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, became his greatest strength, proof that leadership could be born not of arrogance, but of endurance. The saloon itself became a place of gathering, not of fear, but of unity. On certain nights, the townsfolk left a feather resting on the bar in remembrance. They never explained it to strangers, never put words to its meaning. It was enough to know that the feather symbolized the night they chose freedom over fear. The sheriff's name faded into dust, but the feather endured, carrying more weight than his badge ever had. And so, the town thrived, not through wealth or power, but through the quiet strength of a legend. They had been changed forever by a girl who spoke no words, who carried no weapon, yet who had shown them that silence itself could be the loudest voice of all. Decades later, old men with weathered faces would gather by the fire and retell the story, their voices hushed with reverence. "I was there," one would whisper, his eyes distant, "the night she walked in and silence became our salvation." Younger listeners leaned closer, their imaginations ablaze, though none could capture fully the weight of that night. Still, the story lived on, reshaping itself into legend with each retelling, woven into the very identity of the West. Some claimed she had been a spirit, a messenger sent by the ancestors. Others believed she was flesh and blood, a girl of courage who vanished into the plains. But whether she was mortal or more than mortal mattered little. What endured was not her name, nor her face, but the truth she carried, that fear thrives on silence, yet silence used with courage can shatter fear itself. Travelers who passed through the town often heard the tale and carried it with them across deserts and mountains. In distant places, saloons whispered of her, as though she had walked through every door, reminding the powerful that pride crumbles when faced with truth. Her presence, though long gone, stretched far beyond the boundaries of one town, settling into the heart of the Old West as an eternal warning and an eternal hope. By then, the farmer was gone, his life spent in quiet labor. Yet his children and grandchildren carried forward the memory of his dignity, tied forever to the girl who had revealed it. The feather remained on the bar of the saloon, replaced again and again as years passed, each one a symbol that silence, once feared, had become the foundation of their freedom. And so, The town that had once cowered beneath a sheriff's shadow became remembered for something far greater. Not for wealth, not for violence, but for the night a native girl entered a saloon in silence and left behind a legend that taught them all that the strongest voices in history are not always the loudest. In the end, the night the native girl entered the saloon became more than just an event. It became a turning point that echoed through generations. She did not fire a shot. She did not raise her voice. Yet she dismantled the tyranny of fear with nothing but her presence. What she carried was not a weapon, but a truth. That silence, when rooted in courage, can be more powerful than any roar of violence. The town that once trembled under a sheriff's shadow learned that its freedom was born not from steel, but from the unshakable dignity of one girl's defiance. Her story reminds us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and unyielding, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She walked in carrying only a feather, but left behind a legacy stronger than any badge or bullet. The people who witnessed her that night understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand tall even when fear surrounds you. And once they saw it in her, they discovered it within themselves. The sheriff's downfall was not written in gunpowder. It was written in silence. His power crumbled because the people finally recognized that authority without honor is hollow. They had been prisoners of their own fear, and it took one fearless act to break the chains. That lesson outlived him, outlived the saloon, and outlived the passing years. It carved itself into the heart of the West, where legends are measured not by noise, but by the truths they leave behind. Even now, the story of that night holds a mirror to us. How many times do we surrender to fear because we believe our voices are too small, our presence too fragile? Yet her silence proved otherwise, that even without words, a single act of courage can ignite change, can unravel injustice, can inspire unity. Her footsteps remind us that sometimes the quietest moments carry the loudest echoes. If this story moved you, let it remind you of the strength hidden in your own silence, in your own courage. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflection may give others the courage to stand tall as well. And if you wish to keep exploring the forgotten legends of the Old West, stories that reveal truths as timeless as this one, subscribe to the channel and leave your mark with a like. Together, we keep alive the tales that teach us what truly endures: dignity, courage, and the power of standing firm, even in silence.